Hello. So today I want to talk about system dynamics and introduce the basic ideas as well as a little bit of the machinery to how to build system dynamics models. System dynamics is a kind of a tool that has been around, has been brought from engineering and control theory ideas into social sciences in the 50s and 60s by J. Forrester and his students. And these days it is being used both for building theoretical models in the org theory space and for a lot of policy problems in different domains. So to get us started with that, it might be helpful to just start with thinking about why we do modeling and then how the tools that we'll talk about in system dynamics may be relevant for building models. So the first question, why do we even talk about this space of modeling? A very simple answer to it is there is really no solution, no other way, because we always are using models for whatever decision we are making. Now, most of those models we use are mental models that we essentially are qualitatively keeping in our head, trying to simplify the world, make sense of it, and using those constructs to make decisions. And so in that sense, there is no choice without models. And as such, it's not really an interesting question to ask why model. The question is whether and when we want to get help from formal models. And that question is an important one, and the answer is not obvious, that we don't necessarily need to always use models. In fact, for most typical decisions, we don't necessarily need models. But with that in mind, coming into the org theory space and different use cases of models, let's think about kind of broad categories of use cases for models in organizational sciences. So one way I think about this space is that you can use models to build theory and or to use models for thinking about policy questions. These two are somewhat different, even though you may want to kind of build theory that is useful for practice. It is still is helpful to build when you are building theoretical models to focus on something very narrow and very well defined and bring out the core insights and hope that the readers, the people who use those models and interact with those models will build their mental models, will adjust their mental models, their way of seeing the world in a way that helps them deal with practical problems more effectively. So the pathway for impact for theoretical models is that they change our way of looking at the world in a way that hopefully will be more make our thinking a little bit more effective in the actual practical problems. Whereas policy-driven models typically try to actually go into the actual trade-offs in a specific set of cases or a specific individual case and assess those trade-offs and help us answer policy or strategic questions we may have. Now, within this broad category of theory building versus policy-driven models, you may kind of go into subcategories, and you can think about many different ways of breaking this space down. In the organizational sciences and org theory specifically, you can think about two types of theory building modeling work. One I am calling mechanism driven. That is, you start with a kind of a set of key minimalistic structural features of a generic problem context and essentially analyze, assuming those features, those structural characteristics, what do you get in terms of insights, in terms of results that are deduced from those basic premises, and use that for building an argument that then may have generalizability use cases beyond kind of whenever in the real world where we have those underlying structures and mechanisms in place. I think a lot of the famous models in our community from March and Leventhal and others fall into this category. Then you can think about a second category of models that are more based on observations in the field. And usually they start from qualitative research. You do grounded theory building, but you get assistance from modeling to help understand the implications of the mechanisms that you may be observing in the field. So in these cases, typically you go collect data in an organizational setting, you identify important stories, mechanisms, and then you use models to formalize those and identify the implications of those mechanisms beyond the historically observed case. So it essentially gives more generalizability to the case-based method, allows you to go beyond what you have observed in your specific case, and makes your models, on the other hand, better grounded in the empirical work. If you look at system dynamics as a field, it has used this model-assisted grounded theory approach more often when it comes to theory building using models. And then a lot of the work in system dynamics fall into the policy-driven modeling, which may not be the main focus of our workshop and in the TOM community, but it is a pretty, there is a large community of people who care about these policy problems, whether it is in climate policy or marketing strategy. So with that bit of a background, kind of big picture, system dynamics modeling process typically starts with articulating a clear problem, then going through identifying a set of dynamic hypotheses, which can potentially explain the problem. When you think about problem definition in system dynamics, one way, not the only way, but one of the most common ways is to think about trends over time, how variables that you care about might have been changing over time. So you may go into an organizational setting, you ask the stakeholders, the community, okay, what keeps you worried, and how, whether it is profitability, sales, quality, and how that has been changing over time. And you may actually draw these qualitative graphs based on the input from the stakeholders. So that becomes your problem articulation. Then the dynamic hypotheses are stories, mechanisms that people think may be relevant for understanding those trends over time. So that's the basic setup for thinking about creation of dynamic hypotheses, which are typically qualitative, but you want them to be well grounded in actual knowledge of the case, whether it is coming from stakeholders or coming from theory in data space. And then you go towards quantifying that set of hypotheses. We have some tools such as stocks and flows, which are kind of ways of connecting more intuitive ways of understanding accumulation to differential equation models. You then formulate those models, test them, and then you can use the models for policy design, for theory building, whatever you want to do with the model, which kind of can take it in different directions. Of course, the process is very much an iterative process. You may change the direction of the model and its core premises based on the what you are seeing in every step of the process. So that's enough background. Let's jump in and apply this approach to a simple problem, but also kind of learn the tools as we go through this. This is going to be hands-on, so I want you to stop occasionally during the video, kind of get your hands dirty, try to do the exercise, do the next step yourself, then engage with the video to get also some feedback based on how I'm doing what we are talking about. So the problem context, the reference mode that motivates this in this example is Facebook. That's a social media platform that you probably are all familiar with. It has been growing pretty rapidly. In its first few years, 5-6 years of existence, Facebook was growing really fast, about 9% per month. In fact, if it continued to grow with that trajectory, it would have surpassed the world population by 2013. And of course, that's infeasible. So the actual trajectory for growth of Facebook looks more like this. And now it's about 3 billion people who are active monthly users of the platform. So you can see already kind of a reference mode of behavior that is growing exponentially at the beginning and then is slowing down and moving towards more of an S-shaped mode of behavior. So based on this, we can actually define our problem as understanding the growth and the exponential growth and the slowdown of growth of Facebook over the past 20 years or so. And we can take this and start thinking about, okay, how do we understand this reference mode? What are the structural assumptions that are needed for explaining something like this? What are some of the hypotheses? And then how can you formalize those in a quantitative model? So with that basic idea, we now may move into the next step. Now we have defined our problem. We want to go into generating dynamic hypotheses, that is, hypotheses for how things might be changing. And for this process today, I'm going to use software that we use in the field of system dynamics very regularly for building models. It's called VenSim. There are many other alternatives that are as good. Stella Architect as another good option. This is the software I normally use in most of my system dynamics modeling, but you feel free to use it or use other alternatives. It is available for free for personal learning edition of it, PLE version of it, with limited capabilities. It doesn't have all of the bells and whistles, but pretty useful for simple modeling. You can just go to VenSim's website and download the software. And the basic interface for VenSim looks something like this. So when we want to think about a dynamic problem, we may start by actually just putting down the variables we care about. As in this case, Facebook users might be the kind of primary variable we are interested to understand and understand its dynamics. So that's our core variable of interest. Then we ask ourselves what might be the drivers of growth in Facebook users. And you can come up with different stories, and based on those, tell different map out different mechanisms. So here I may add kind of a very simple mechanistic step that you need adoption of Facebook by people to have more Facebook users. So Facebook adoption is a driver of Facebook users, and I'm kind of using these causal links. And these are causal in the sense that they actually make things happen. They are not correlational variables, and you may want to save your model so that it has it is saved, and you may want to make sure these causal links also have polarities. And to think about polarities for causal links, here I'm going to put a positive polarity. You can right click and put a positive mark for the polarity. What that means is that as you increase adoption of Facebook, the number of users goes up, so they move in the same direction. More formally, you can say when there is a causal link from variable A to variable B, the positive polarity means the partial derivative of variable B with respect to variable A is positive, and a negative links means the partial derivative is negative. Now, in most cases, you may have a good feel for what those partial derivatives signs might be, even though you may have no idea how strong those mechanisms are. That's where kind of empirical work comes in. But your theoretical understanding usually allows you to come up with these links and their polarities to a good extent, especially in organizational setting. You talk with people who know the business well, or know that theoretical context well, you can get quite a bit of these in place. And in some settings, you may need to go into the literature to identify the links that are really important and their polarities. So here we have a couple of examples. If you increase your bank balance, your interest earned increases. And if you decrease bank balance, interest earned decreases. Therefore, the polarity is positive. And if you increase price, everything else being equal, your demand goes down. And if you decrease price, demand goes up. So that means a negative polarity in this setting. It's helpful to kind of do a little bit of an exercise on these polarities so that the concept is clear. So feel free to do these for yourself before I put some polarities. So if you think about the production process, you have an inventory, you produce material that goes into your inventory, and then when you ship to your customers, that depletes your inventory. So what would be the polarities there? Well, from production to inventory, the more production, the more inventory, they are moving in the same direction. So it would be a positive link. And then from shipments to inventory, it would be a negative link, because as you increase shipment, inventory would go below what it would have been absent that increase in shipment. From sales force to orders booked, the more sales force you have, the more orders you are likely to book. Again, everything else being equal. So that's another positive link here. And more price will lead to fewer orders booked. Again, everything else being equal. There are other pathways that through price you may have signaling of a status, which then potentially increases sales, but that's a pathway that goes through an intermediate variable. And if you want to capture that separately, you can add an intermediate variable of perceive the status, and then you have a link from price to perceive the status that increases, that has a positive polarity, and then from perceived status to orders booked, that would again have a positive polarity that explains the other pathway you might be thinking. Last one, pretty straightforward. More births, more population, therefore a positive polarity, and more death, fewer population, therefore a negative polarity in this example. So those are simple examples. And now we could go, so let's go back to our Facebook example, and let me clear these polarities. Oops. Now, so far we have talked about the basic idea of people adopting Facebooks and becoming Facebook users. This is kind of a very simple mechanistic story. There is nothing here. There is really no mechanism here. But now we need actually a little bit more. We need to tell a story how Facebook users were growing, and they are still growing, but what's the driver of growth, and especially in the early phase. So if you break down Facebook's history in kind of the early phase of exponential growth, and then the slowdown phase, that is the secondary part of its history, how would you understand the first exponential growth phase for the first few years of Facebook's history? And this is one of those places that we can actually use some of the regularities we see in dynamics of systems to help us generate hypotheses. So one of the key regularities in this space is that there are types of feedback mechanisms. Feedback mechanisms is when something impacts something else. So X impacts Y, and Y may go through some processes to ultimately change X later on, and that creates a full feedback process. So in this space, when you have reinforcing loops, if they are the primary driver of dynamics in any system, they can create exponential growth or exponential collapse. So they are the drivers of growth in systems. They are the drivers of heterogeneity in system, because if some agent or some subsystem or some example uses those reinforcing loops to grow, it widens its gap with other players inside the system. So reinforcing loops are important for understanding heterogeneity. They're important for understanding growth. And the other way to think about this is, if you have a phenomenon that is going through growth and exponential growth especially, then you should look for reinforcing loops. So here is a kind of a very simple example. You think about compounding of interest. You have money in your bank. It earns interest if you don't withdraw, and all of that money is reinvested into your account, and that increases your bank balance, completing a reinforcing feedback loop. So one variable to the other variable back to the first one. And that feedback loop left alone creates an exponential growth in your bank balance. Now, back to our Facebook example, if we have Facebook's historical performance shows exponential growth, it indicates that there might be some reinforcing feedback processes that generate that exponential growth. And therefore, it is helpful to think about reinforcing feedback loops in the context of Facebook. So let's think about that. Let's think about some possible reinforcing loops. And I'll give you an example, then you can kind of stop the video, think about a few more yourself, then we come back and kind of do a few more reinforcing loops that may be relevant for understanding Facebook's growth. At this point, we don't necessarily know as much about Facebook market. Most of you probably don't know too much about it, but you know enough to be able to create some plausible hypothesis. You probably don't know enough to prioritize which one is more likely to be really important. And some of the value of the modeling comes from allowing us to kind of narrow down the range of more plausible hypotheses. Okay, so what's a good story for growth in Facebook's users over time, which can also become a reinforcing feedback process? One very simple idea is word of mouth. You have more Facebook users, they talk about Facebook with their friends and colleagues, which then increases awareness of Facebook, which leads to adoption if some of those folks who now have learned about Facebook find it interesting, and that leads to more Facebook users. So more users, more awareness of Facebook in the marketplace, and that awareness increases Facebook adoption. So we can have the causal links. And note that I'm using variable names that have a clear sense of direction. That is, awareness of Facebook can go up or come down. If I use the variable name such as a strategy, it wouldn't have a clear sense of direction. So it wouldn't be a good variable name. We want to be able to more quickly move from these qualitative models to building a quantitative version. And then as awareness of Facebook goes up, adoption goes up. So that's another positive polarity here that we can include. So that gives us a full feedback loop. Now we have to determine the polarity of this feedback loop. And there are different ways you can do it. Some of you might have noticed that if you have all positive links, you probably will have a reinforcing loop. But let's go through the more reliable method of determining the feedback loop polarity, and that is by just doing a thought experiment. If one of these variables go up or down, and it doesn't matter, you can go in either direction. Let's say Facebook users go up. What happens to awareness of Facebook? well, that goes up. And if awareness of Facebook goes up, Facebook adoption goes up. And if Facebook adoption goes up, number of Facebook users will go further up. So this process is a reinforcing loop. In engineering jargon, it is called a positive feedback. And what it does is that if you push the system in one direction, it pushes you even further in that direction. So that's the reason we call it a reinforcing loop. Once you have determined the polarity of a loop, going through this method of going around the loop, which, as I said, is a little bit more reliable, you may want to also put a name for your loop, so you can later summarize that idea. So I'm using this comment tool from Vensim to put R sign for a reinforcing loop. And I am saying that the shape of this is a clockwise loop, because what I have drawn is moving clockwise. I just make it a little bit smaller. And then we can put a name for this loop. So word of mouth is a simple name you can assign for this loop. Okay, so we have created our first reinforcing loop for explaining Facebook's early phase growth. It's a word of mouth story. Now, it's a good time to think about other alternatives. So why don't you pause the video and think about a few more feedback loops that are of reinforcing nature and add them to the diagram. Actually build this diagram yourself. You can use a piece of paper, or you can use Vensim if you like. We'll use Vensim in other parts of this class as well, so you can adopt that if you wish. So pause when you felt you have exhausted your ideas for reinforcing loops and you have implemented them in your diagram. Come back, we'll do a couple of those together. Okay, so let's go back to our diagram and add a few more loops. So this process is usually a process informed by different stakeholders who know more about the topic you're looking at, who may have some ideas for what might be driving it. It's also a little bit of an exploratory process. You may actually say, oh, I think Facebook adoption is partly driven by attractiveness of Facebook. So you may put that variable of attractiveness and then ask yourself, what drives attractiveness of Facebook? And through that process, you may start to identify other loops that you didn't initially recognize as loops. So what might be driving the attractiveness of Facebook? Well, Facebook's features and functionality are important. So that's one driver of attractiveness you may think about. So features and functionality. You may think about other drivers. So how many of your friends are already part of Facebook is a big driver of its value to you. So the size of Facebook's users actually does have a direct impact on its attractiveness. So that may actually create another loop already. So from Facebook users, you may go to Facebook attractiveness, and this link is positive. More Facebook users, more attractiveness of Facebook. So now we have actually created another feedback loop. And let me add this feature and functionality causal link as well. So this is not lost to us. Okay, so now we have added another feedback loop and we can test its polarity. So let's do a quick test of polarity. So we could say Facebook users or Facebook adoption, if it grows, goes up. we'll have more Facebook users. More Facebook user means more attractiveness of Facebook, which then increases Facebook adoption further. So that is indeed a reinforcing loop. So we can put our reinforcing loop. We can put our reinforcing loop here. I'm just copying and pasting that to simplify, adding a new loop. And this loop should have a different name. Word of mouth was for the first mechanism. What's the mechanism for this loop? You may think of this as the network effect. Essentially, most of the social networks, their primary source of value is in their ability to bring people together who care to interact with each other, and therefore the larger their size of their user base, the more attractive they are for new users. So we could call this network effect as a name for this loop. Okay, so we have another reinforcing loop captured here, and let me remove all these drawings. Let's think more. So we already have another idea here for features and functionality. So what might be driving features and functionality for Facebook? Well, it's R&D investments in its development of new features into the platform. So those are kind of standard pathways. So you can think about R&D investments as one of the drivers or primary drivers of features and functionality. That's a positive link. And then where do R&D investments come from, and how could we potentially create a loop here? Well, you may observe that Facebook users are source of income for Facebook. Now, they don't directly pay Facebook. They actually make Facebook more attractive for advertisers who do pay Facebook. So you may have the linkage from Facebook users to ad revenue here. And then ad revenue potentially can feed R&D investments. Now, that's part of these mechanisms are mechanistic. You have money, so you can invest. And part of it is a managerial choice. That is how much of your revenue you want to allocate to investments in R&D versus other factors. So that's why the polarity of these things are typically clear, but you can't tell how strong it is because different managerial choices may change the strength of these linkages. But both of these are, in this case, are also positive. So you would have yet another loop that is generated here. Again, we can go through the identification of polarity. So more Facebook users, more ad revenue, more R&D investment, more features and functionality, more attractive platform, leading to more adoption and therefore even more Facebook users. So that's therefore what kind of a loop? A reinforcing one. And again, we put the sign, we put a shorthand name for it so that you can communicate the core idea of this hypothesis for explaining the growth space of Facebook without too much hassle. This could be called R&D. So let's keep it simple. And let's remove the drawings. Okay, so we have added quite a few loops. You can add more. So another kind of a common loop that our students suggest is the advertising loop, that with more ad revenue, you will have more advertising available to Facebook. And that allows them to, let me move this a little bit down. So So this is advertising Facebook to the broader community for people to join it. This is different from ad revenue that Facebook receives as a platform. So an advertising Facebook then increases awareness of Facebook. So again, you would make sure you could put this guy in the middle. So positive links and both of these. And this becomes yet another loop. More Facebook users, more ad revenue, more advertising of Facebook, increase awareness about Facebook, more Facebook adoption, more Facebook users. And that these together create another reinforcing loop. Which we could call ad budget. So this is ability to allocate more money to advertising your platform. Again, this is definitely not an exhaustive list, but a decent starting point for building a little bit of a theory about the Facebook's early stage growth. Now, going back to our problem statement, the next part of Facebook's story is the slowdown in growth that we could observe in the last 10 years or so. And understanding that a slowdown in growth may require a different set of mechanisms. In fact, again, one of those generic insights is that there is a different type of a feedback loop that allows, that kind of gets systems to stabilize, to move towards some underlying equilibrium, towards some desired value. That type of feedback loop is called a balancing loop. And you have it all over us. I mean, just lots of balancing feedbacks are happening inside our body, keeping things in equilibrium, from our temperature to blood glucose levels, to your oxygen saturation level and so on. But they're all over us. And here is just one simple example, thinking about the supply and demand curves in terms of dynamics of supply and demand. So you can see that if price goes up for a product in a market, the demand for it comes down. That brings down the ratio of demand to supply, which puts a pressure, downward pressure on price, bringing price down. So that overall means if we push the system in one direction, increase the price, the system pushes back to bring itself towards the original state. That is why it is called a balancing feedback loop. We denote that with this B sign in the middle of the loop. And the typical behavior that comes out of balancing feedbacks is a system that is moving towards some underlying equilibrium, or the pressures that are pushing the system towards some underlying equilibrium. So with that idea in mind, and remembering that Facebook has had a long history over which its growth rate has actually been slowing down, then we should potentially make a connection that, oh, there should be then balancing feedbacks that may slow down, may have been slowing down Facebook's growth over the last decade. And we can start incorporating those into our model here. So let's think about a few of those. Kind of one of the simplest balancing loops in any model of this sort is that when people adopt your platform, there are fewer people left who can adopt your platform. So Facebook adoption not only depends on attractiveness and awareness, but also depends on the number of potential adopters who are not yet adopters. And that is an important just physical constraint or mechanism that we need to be mindful of. Now, the important realization here is that as you increase Facebook adoption, you are draining the pool of potential adopters. So there is a linkage from Facebook adoption to potential adopters, and that linkage is actually having a negative polarity, because as you increase Facebook adoption, fewer potential adopters remain. So brings down potential adopters. And therefore, we have now a new feedback mechanism. And this new feedback mechanism, we can identify its polarity using our regular method. So if we increase Facebook adoption, what do we get? We get fewer potential adopters available, so that brings down potential adopters. If we bring down potential adopters, what will happen to Facebook adoption? Well, it will come down below what it would have been otherwise. So that means a move in one direction pushed us in the opposite direction. Therefore, we are dealing with a balancing feedback loop in this setting. So let's make that linkage here. So this time it is not a reinforcing loop, it is a balancing loop, and it is not a clockwise loop, it is counterclockwise. The clockwise or counterclockwise is based on how we have put the diagrams. So it's just a visual support for our thinking about the problem. And then we need a name for this loop. So what's the idea of this loop? This loop is saying, as Facebook grows, it basically saturates the market. There are fewer people left who can join Facebook, and therefore its speed of growth should slow down. Pretty simple, mechanistic, but also important story. Let's put a name for it. It could be saturation. And let me also remove these drawings. So that becomes a balancing loop for Facebook that we can think about. Now, it would be good for you to think about some other balancing processes that may be relevant for understanding Facebook's slowdown. So please go ahead, pause the video, take some time to come up with other balancing mechanisms that may be relevant. And once you have those and kind of you run out of ideas, then restart, we can go through a couple of those together. Okay, so now we are adding a few more balancing loops. So what are some of the ideas for balancing processes for Facebook? We already talked about saturation. You may think about competition as always being an important balancing process. As Facebook grows, it kind of others start to see this market as an attractive market and start coming into the market, reducing the relative attractiveness of Facebook versus other players. So if you may have alternatives to Facebook, social media, social networks to Facebook. That brings down attractiveness of Facebook. So this is pretty straightforward. Now, how could you turn this into a feedback loop? One way to think about it, to get to the feedbacky nature of this competition story, is that the reason a lot of competitors joined this market was partly the existence of Facebook as a proof of this market being viable and attractive. So as Facebook users and Facebook revenue have grown, that has made this market as more viable, more attractive. And you can think of it in different ways. Not only it is the signaling value, but also it is in building the infrastructure for advertisers to appreciate this market and so on. So there are different ways that the market becomes more attractive for competition when Facebook grows. So that way we could say attractiveness of social network or perceived attractiveness of social network market may go up as Facebook grows. Now, whether you get it from revenues or directly from the number of users, you can make your call based on your understanding of the drivers of those decisions by potential competitors to enter this market. And as perceived attractiveness goes up, you would have more alternative social networks, and then those alternative social networks increase introduction of alternative social networks or okay. Launching of, and that increases the number of alternatives to Facebook. So more attractive market, more alternatives, which then bring down Facebook's attractiveness. And this creates yet another feedback loop. So we can go from Facebook users, more attractiveness perceived in this market, more alternatives launched, more alternatives available, lower attractiveness of Facebook, reduced adoption of Facebook, reduced number of users compared to what it would have been otherwise. That closes our balancing loop. And this is a balancing loop, which we can call competition. Okay. We can add more loops. So you could think about, for example, spam. As Facebook grows, there are more spammers on Facebook. You may think about advertising that actually reduces attractiveness of Facebook to its users, potentially. You may think about regulation, another important kind of set of constraints on growth of Facebook that is triggered partly by its growth. So those ideas could all be added to this diagram to create a more nuanced set of balancing feedback loops. But you get the idea. So we have now created a set of what we call dynamic hypotheses. These are hypotheses for explaining the mode of behavior we were trying to explain. They are not the solution. They are not telling us exactly what happened to Facebook's history, but they give us some things that we can go collect data on, build models of to test and to kind of zoom into more viable explanatory mechanisms for our story. You can do this with a group of clients from any organization. You can do this with qualitative researchers who may be your collaborators who have kind of understood the processes that are relevant. So building these causal loop diagrams is, as you can see, pretty rapid, and you can develop a large number of relevant mechanisms fairly quickly. Now, at this point, we are ready to move towards a more quantitative model, which is at the heart of system dynamics and what you may care about when thinking about building models in the organizational sciences space. And to do that, we introduce a new concept, a new construct, which is stocks and flows. So this is kind of one of those building blocks that allows us to move from the qualitative causal loop diagram that we built together towards a more quantitative model of Facebook's dynamics. And in this case, we kind of to define the concept, we think about stock variables as the things that accumulate, things that have inertia, that have captured the state of the system. And those types of variables are typically measured in units of things. So whether it is dollars, defects, people, widgets, they are usually changed only through some flow variable. A variable that changes the stock is called a flow variable. And the flow variables, by definition, have units of whatever the stock is divided by a unit of time. Now, however you want to measure time. So it could be in dollars per month, or defects per day, or widgets per year. It is when you look at a kind of a system and a set of variables that you care about, you may think about stocks or identify stocks using what we call a freeze test. That is, you freeze the system, you take a snapshot of the system in this frozen state and see what are the things that are tangible, visible. Those are the stock variables, and things that are not, but would change those stocks variables become flow variables. There are kind of a few rules in thinking about building stock and flow structures. So the stock variables are the boxes, flow variables, all these valves that go into stocks and flows. So here we have stock with an outflow that goes out of it and an inflow that goes into it. Stocks and flows directly map into differential equations. So when you have a stock with an inflow and outflow, essentially underlying that notation is a differential equation in which a stock is the integral of inflow minus outflow with some initial value for the stock. If you prefer that differential equation notation, the derivative of a stock with respect to time is inflow minus outflow. So as soon as we bring stocks and flows, we are making connections to a more rigorous mathematical representation of the model we are building. Now, it is helpful to note that not everything is a stock or a flow variable, but some variables are neither this nor that. They are helpful for building our models. So now going back to our Facebook example, we have already laid out our kind of causal loop diagram. We may at this point say, okay, now I want to quantify my model, build an actual simulation model. How do I do that? You may start by identifying feedback mechanisms that you actually think are either central or are easier to model and therefore good starting point. And after you have identified those, you go into the identification of stock variables that are important within those feedback loops for understanding those feedback loops. Those stock variables may already be part of your qualitative model, or sometimes you may actually come up with new variables that capture the core inertia inside those feedback loops. So for our exercise, we are going to focus our attention on the two simple loops of saturation and word of mouth. These are pretty central loops, but also very simple in the sense that you don't need to focus kind of to identify too many auxiliary processes of how R&D investments happens or how competition decides to join the market. It's all feasible to add those additional mechanisms, but we want for our first model to be something simple we can build together in a limited amount of time. So let's focus on these two mechanisms of word of mouth and saturation, and therefore you can ignore all the rest of these items on the diagram. And then you would ask yourself, okay, what are good stock variables to capture inertial factors in this model? What among these variables do we have on the board, or inertial variables that may be relevant for understanding these dynamics beyond those that are already on the board? So any of these variables that are good candidates for being a stock variable. So take a second, think about that, see what you would choose as a good stock variable or two, and whether they are on the board or you think of them separately, that's also fine. Things that might be hidden inside these stories. Take a second, choose your stock variables, and then we go through it together. Okay, so some of you may have identified Facebook users. It's a pretty good stock variable. If I take a snapshot of the system, I look at it, I can count the number of Facebook users. It is really key to the dynamics of growth of users. It is an inertial concept that grows slowly over time. Only it grows through adoption of Facebook, and it may deplete as people leave Facebook platform. So it has all of those characteristics of stock variables. Another one you might have identified is potential adopters of Facebook's. So that is also very much of a stock variable. It captures all the people who may be interested in Facebook, but currently are not on the platform. These are people who do have access to the internet. So as a stock variable, you can think about a kind of a set of people. The flow into the stock is happening through people gaining access to the internet, people growing up to the age that they might be interested in using Facebook. And then the outflow from that may be happening through adoption of Facebook. So some people become customers, or if something happens that makes some people decide, I'm never going to be interested in Facebook because they did this bad thing, or they are not providing anything interesting, then you have an outflow from that potential adopters pool as well. So that starts to give you ideas for capturing the stock variables. Now, as we want to move from a qualitative model we have built to something quantitative, I'll start a new model here and incorporate our stock and flow diagram there. In this new model, you need to decide what's kind of your unit of time, whether it is months or year, what is the initial time. You can have the actual kind of years of 2004 to 2040 or something as your unit of time. The time step concept is about numerical integration, how kind of precise your numerical integration will be when you simulate the model. And for that, usually kind of a smaller value is fine. So now we can start our new model. And let's save that. And we can start adding our, and let me actually share the half a screen so we have the causal loop diagram here as well. So we can start by adding the stock variables we have identified. It would be Facebook potential adopters. And I'll have a shorthand for them so that if you want to write the equations, it's easier to kind of have a shorthand version for equations as well. And then we have the other stock variable, Facebook users or adopters, and I'll put A for it. So these are my stock variables. Next, we can think about flow variables that are changing these stock variables. We already talked about a few of those, from people growing up to the age that they can adopt Facebook, to people dying and therefore leaving these dynamics, to people adopting Facebook and therefore moving from potential adopters to current adopters, to churn, that is people leaving Facebook altogether. You can incorporate all of those flow variables. Again, to keep things simple, let's just focus on the adoption process as the primary flow variable that connects these stocks. That is, every person who adopts Facebook moves from a potential adopter into becoming an adopter. So you can call that adoption rate, or AR for a shorthand. So now we have a simple stock and flow structure that says people move through adoption rate from potential adopters to adopters. Okay, so far so good. With that backbone, we have actually captured some of the basic features of the model. In fact, we already have 3 of the variables in our qualitative model. So I could just simply have the links that replicate the diagram on the right-hand side here and have a still qualitative but a little bit more operational causal loop diagram. That is, I could have a link from potential adopters to adoption rate, which is resembling the link here. I could have awareness of Facebook in the middle, so have a link from Facebook adopters to awareness, and then from there to adoption rate. But instead of doing that as an intermediate step, I want to just jump into building the model with a more operational storytelling. So that's why I'm deleting that link, and so that we can start building that operational story together. So let's think about the operational story of word of mouth. So what's the story of word of mouth? The story of word of mouth is that people are interacting with each other in the community, in the society. Some of those people are Facebook adopters or users. Some of them are potential users, potential adopters. And whenever a potential adopter and a current adopter come into contact with each other, there is a chance the current adopter talks about Facebook, introduces that idea to the potential adopter, and then there is a probability that that introduction leads to adoption of Facebook by the other person, by the potential adopter. So that's a mechanistic story of word of mouth. Now we talked about people coming into contact with each other. This can be more broadly thought of as any type of contact. You may send an email in which you share that information. You may kind of put some story about it on your social media contacts. It could take different shapes, but to start modeling that more effectively, we want to break down this fairly high level logic that we have here, that is more Facebook users, more awareness of Facebook, more adoption, into something more mechanistic. So maybe pause the video for a second and think about how you would formulate that, how we would come up with an equation or a set of equations. And it's not kind of as direct. You may need intermediate variables to calculate the different steps of the process to quantify the adoption rate. But you want to basically calculate what the adoption rate would be given a current level of adopters and potential adopters. And then we will walk through the steps of that together. So feel free to take a pause, think about that, and then we'll work it. So one way, and it is not the only way, but one way to capture that idea is to say people, the potential adopters, have a number of interactions in the society. So you may call that social contacts, which is a number of interactions between potential adopters and the rest of the community, and anybody else. It can be potential adopters or adopters that they are interacting with. And those social contacts may end up to be with adopters. So you may have contacts with adopters, and let me also add this shorthand for this one, SC. So those social contacts may end up to be with adopters. So let's call that contacts with adopters. So that's the next leg of the mechanism or the story of how these contacts are happening. And then as a fraction of those contacts with adopters can lead to adoption through word of mouth. So And again, let me add a name for this, CA for contacts with adopters. And then we would have adoption from word of mouth. AW as the total number of adoptions that happen as a result of contacts between adopters and social and potential adopters, and that adoption from word of mouth is driving the adoption rate. On the other side, you have to think about, okay, contacts with adopters, to get from social contacts to contacts with adopters, that is contacts between potential adopters and adopters, you need to know what's the fraction of contacts, what's the probability that a random contact, a random social contact is with an adopter. So that probability becomes important. Probability of contact with adopters, PCA. And then as the probability of contacts with adopters could then depend on the number of adopters. So that's the last link to complete a few of our loops. So now you have the loop from more adopters to probability of contacts, more probability of contacts with adopters, more contacts between adopters and potential adopters, more adoption from word of mouth, and therefore higher adoption rate. And then you have, this is the reinforcing loop, therefore, and then you have the balancing loop that says more potential adopters, more social contacts, more contacts between potential and adopters, more adoption from word of mouth, and therefore more adoption rate, which reduces potential adopters. So that's the balancing loop we have. We can put the polarities on all of these links. And in this case, they're all positive, I believe. And this is kind of moving towards operationalizing the model. You may notice that it is not yet fully operational. It doesn't have equations. It is also not specifying all the other things you need to put equations in it. So for example, social contacts is the total number of contacts that potential adopters have on a daily or monthly or annual basis, whatever is your unit of time. So if you have 100 people and they are making 100 contacts per year with other people in the community, so 100 multiplied by 100 contacts per year would be the number of contacts you would have. Or so you need something about how many people they meet per unit of time. Contact rate, small c, would be a parameter that informs social contacts. Similarly, if you have a contact between a potential adopter and an adopter here, that doesn't directly translate, and let me make this a little bit bigger, that doesn't directly translate into adoption from word of mouth. Only a fraction of those lead to adoption from word of mouth. So you may have some intermediate variable, adoption fraction, let's call it I, driving this equation beyond just contacts between potential adopters and adopters. Finally, you need a little bit more clear story for how to calculate probability of contact with adopters based on the current number of adopters. So think about that. You can come up with different stories depending on how you think the community is structured. If everybody was randomly interacting with everybody else, then this probability of contact would be directly proportional, or would be actually directly what fraction of population is adopters. So that's the simplest starting point we can start with. And in that case, you would need to have a total population here. That then adopters divided by total population, that's a negative link here, leads to your probability of contact, random contact being with an adopter. And then you could also decide that your total population is how it is, what it consists of. In a model that only captures potential adopters and adopters and is ignoring everything else, then total population would simply be the adopters plus the potential adopters, and that's all. So in this version of the model, we can just use that for our total population equation. So this completes our model structure. We can, of course, add our loops here. And I'm not sure if I could grab and paste them here, but let's try. Yep, it works. So word of mouth is here. Saturation is here. So those loops are also in place. Okay, so we have now completed the basic architecture of the model. We have not yet added any of the equations. To add the equations, in Vensim, you go through this equation tool, and then once you click on that, all the variables that don't have an equation become dark. So you can click on each and add your desired equation. But before that, let's actually stop and have you go through deciding on the equations. Make sure for each variable you think about this unit. So whether they're in the units of people or people per year or whatever is the right unit for those variables, and come up with equations that you think are appropriate here, and then for all of the parameters, that is those variables that don't have a equation, they just have a value. So here in this model, contact rate and adoption fraction are parameters. There is no arrow going into them. They have a value that you can use for the simulations. So for those, decide what is the appropriate value you want to use. Go through that exercise. If you are using Vensim, that's probably a good place to do this. When you click on a variable, a dialog box for equations comes here. You can see the parameters, the variables that go into that equation down here. You can set the units for the variable here. So you can use this dialog box to complete the equations. And when you're done, come back and we'll walk through this together. Okay, let's get started with our equations. So social contacts. You have a number of people who are potential adopters. You multiply that by number of contacts each potential adopter has per unit of time. That's your contact rate. You get to the total number of social contacts. And the unit for this thing is in person per year. If year is your unit of analysis, because each person meets a number of other people every year, and that's your contact rate. So your contact rate is then in the units of 1/year. And you can decide, well, how many people each person sees per year, how many distinct people that they may talk about Facebook with. So maybe 50. And you can decide what the right value is based on comparing your model's outcomes with the data later on, or you may decide on appropriate values based on your qualitative knowledge of the case, and knowing kind of your ethnographic data can inform some of these parameter values. Then contacts with adopters. So that's the total number of social contacts multiplied by what fraction of a random contact might be, what's the probability a random contact is with a current adopter. That's the PCA. So that gives you in person per year the number of contacts between adopters and social adopter and potential adopters. So that's our CA equation. Then for probability of contact with adopters, the story we told was that we just look at the fraction of population that is adopter. So that's adopters divided by total population. And as a fraction, this thing has no units, that is, it is dimensionless. So you can use DM and L in Vensim lingo for dimensionless and put that here. Then we have total population, that is simply adopters plus potential adopters, and it is in the unit of person. Then we have adoption from word of mouth, which is how many contacts do we have between adopters and potential adopters, and then what fraction of those contacts may actually lead to adoption. So the units will be person per year, because adoption fraction is a dimensionless thing, and contacts with adopters is in person per year. So that's this equation. Adoption fraction, again, you can decide. Maybe the probability that I adopt Facebook after talking with a friend who has mentioned it to me is, I don't know, 5%. And then you can, again, based on both your qualitative data and quantitative fit of your simulations with data, decide whether that's the right range for this parameter. Adoption rate in this equation, for now, we are just thinking about one pathway for adoption, and that is adoption through word of mouth. So we are just going to use adoption from word of mouth. But we are separating those two variables, adoption rate and adoption from word of mouth, so that if later on we add another mechanism for adoption that is different from word of mouth, we can add it to this model in a more modular fashion without editing other equations. We can separate those pathways for adoption explicitly. So this is in the units of person per year, and we close that equation. The only thing that remains is now the number of adopters and potential adopters. So for Facebook adopters, how many initial adopters do we have? You can decide on that. Here, as you can see, when I open the equation for a stock variable, the one that we started with a S sign up here, it automatically completes the equation and says adopters is the integral of adoption rate. So it already knows the basic equation given the structure that we have defined for the model. The unit for adopters is in person, and the initial value, you should decide what it is. So you may decide I want it to be a parameter that I can change. So I'm just adding that parameter to the system. Now this equation is white, it's completed. I put a number for initial adopters. Maybe there was one initial person interested or on Facebook's network that we have as initial adopter. And similarly for potential adopters, you need to decide what is the number of, the unit is person, what's the number of initial number of people. And in this case, you may say, I would go with total initial total population minus our variable initial adopters. So initial adopters can come here. So this way you keep the total population at initial total population, because everybody is either in the stock of potential adopters or adopters, and they are only moving between these two stocks. They are not leaving the system. So this way, by initializing the potential adopters from total initial population minus initial adopter, we make sure the two stocks together have exactly the same, the number of initial total population in them. And then we just specify that parameter, initial total population. This is the population who could have adopted Facebook. So let's say 3,000 millions of people, or 3 billion people. So let's think of the person unit as millions of people in this case, in which case initial adopters, 1 million is too much. So maybe you go with a few thousand people here. Okay, so now we have a complete model for Facebook's dynamics that we can start simulating. And if you want to simulate this model in Vensim, you can just put a name for the run so that it saves the data inside this run, and you just push the simulate button. And I have set up this to compile the models. Don't need that, so I have to stop that, but that's okay. So now we have simulated this model, and now you can look at the dynamics of any of these variables. So potential adopters, it is going down to 0, and adopters are growing rapidly, slowly at the beginning, and then much more rapidly, and then again slowly towards the end. And by 2012, all of the 3 billion population that would have potentially been interested in Facebook are exhausted in this simulation. So note a few features of this, and actually let me just do a couple of things. One is remove the compiling so that we can do simulations more rapidly. So the other thing is to add a graph so that we can see the results of our simulations more quickly. So I'm adding a graph here for the Facebook adopters. Okay, so now, second graph for now. So now we can actually simulate this model for different values of the parameters and see the different modes of behavior that emerge. So let's say, for example, we go into this synthesis mode, that triangle with a few arrows behind it, put the model in a setting where you can actually change the parameters live and see the impact on the behavior. So you can see an increase in the number of initial adopters allows you to start or brings back the exponential growth earlier on. A reduction in the number of contacts slows down adoption rate. And similarly, adoption fraction, as you increase it, you speed up adoption. So those are kind of the core parameters. And of course, if you increase the number of people who could adopt Facebook, you get to larger overall adoption trajectories. So let's get everything to their basic level. So now this is the simplified model, simple model that we built together. If you start with no initial adopters, which actually is kind of plausible for a new company, which Facebook was when it was introduced in 2004, what will happen to this model? Actually, make a guess. What will happen with 0 initial adopters? And let's then run that simulation together. Okay. Let's see what happens. Okay, here is Facebook adopters with 0 initial adopters, which is essentially nothing is happening. Why nothing is happening? Well, because if you don't have anybody to talk about Facebook, then you don't have any adoption from word of mouth. And given that adoption from word of mouth is the only channel for adoption here, then you don't have anything happening at all. So this is a good simulation of the world pre-Facebook. No Facebook adopters, nothing happening, boring model though. And that points to the question of, okay, what are the other channels for adoption that may be relevant? We are capturing the adoption from word of mouth, but we are not capturing any other channels for adoption. So what are some of the other channels for adoption? Probably the biggest other one is adoption through advertising. So we could add that component into this model. In fact, that's a fairly easy addition. So we could just directly start adding it into this model by saying that, oh, in a kind of operational manner, I may have some advertising budget that touches people who are in the society, that I may expose a number of folks or a fraction of the population to my ads based on that advertising budget. And out of those people who get exposed, a fraction of them are potential adopters. So that's kind of the group that I can influence, because the ones who are adopters, I'm wasting my ad money on them. If they are exposed to it, they're already in the platform. And then out of those potential adopters who get exposed, a fraction may adopt as a result of that ad. So the causal chain is, I have a total budget that exposes a fraction of the population. Out of that fraction of population, a group, a subset are potential adopters. Out of those potential adopters who are exposed, a subset will adopt. So you can multiply those parameters with each other and say, okay, my advertising based on the amount that I spend on it and how effective it is, gives me a parameter of ad effectiveness, which then creates adoption from advertising. And now we would have a link from adoption from potential adopters to adoption from advertising, and these two go together into adoption rate. So adoption from advertising is now ad effectiveness multiplied by potential adopters. So again, ad effectiveness is capturing what fraction of, or what number of potential adopters I'm exposing, and out of that, and what's the fraction of those exposed who are willing to adopt Facebook after seeing those ads. So this will be in person per year, and ad effectiveness, you should decide what fraction of the potential adopters annually might have decided to adopt Facebook, maybe 1% as a result of advertising. So this one would be in 1 per unit of year. This is fraction per year. And then total adoption rate is now adoption from word of mouth plus adoption from ads. So remember, now this gives you a more modular way of modeling different sources of adoption. So now what we have created is called the Bass diffusion model. This is actually one of the most famous models in the whole marketing literature. It's kind of the workhorse of building models of marketing. Of course, this is kind of the building block these days. If somebody wants to build a more operational model, they would start with this building block, but add a lot more complexity to it. But this is pretty standard in the marketing literature. Frank Bass wrote the paper in Management Science in the 1960s. It has tens of thousands of citations. And this model is historically was used to estimate these key parameters of the model, specifically contact rate and adoption fraction, adoption fraction or contact rate. And if you notice, the two are completely interdependent. That is, only the multiplication of these two matters, not any of them individually. So you can fix one and take the other one in terms of estimating historical trajectories, and then ad effectiveness is the second parameter. So you really have two important parameters in this model to calibrate the performance of this model to historical data. And if you run this model here, you can see with different levels of ad effectiveness, you can actually speed up adoption quite a bit. You don't need negative numbers here, so better to limit your sliders to positive values. And even if you have 0 initial adopters here, and you have a very small adoption fraction, you may still get a notable adoption trajectory through advertising. So now, if ad effectiveness is 2% per year, you will see kind of some improvement through some early adoption through ads, and then after that, word of mouth takes over and becomes the dominant mechanism for adoption. So that's the basic story of the model. You could also import the data for Facebook into this model and compare the performance of the model against the data. This version of the model here has the data also built into it. Just need to incorporate Facebook data here. And if we now run this model, you can see the simulation in blue, and in red you can see the historical data, and you can now play with the different parameters to try to better match the historical performance in this case. So maybe something along these lines would be a good mix of parameters. So this is the model which we were just exploring, the Bass diffusion model. So for the next exercise, you can actually download the Bass diffusion model that we just built here from the link down here. And the data for Facebook is already there inside this VDFX file. So you can open it and play with those parameters, trying to fit the historical data, fit the model against the historical data for Facebook, and see what mix of parameters give the best fit here. And so I would say pause, go through this exercise. It's fun. You'll play a little bit with the model and data. You have a better feel for how it may work, and then come back. So if you have done that, you would get a fit that could, depending on what time frame you look at, this is up to 2014, the fit of the model, and then with the data until 2022, this is the new fit for the best fit for the model. And with the more advanced version of Vensim, you can automate that process of calibrating the model to data, essentially changing model parameters to minimize the gap between the historical data and the simulations, which is what I've done here. And you can actually look at the numbers to see what the resulting parameters are. So the resulting parameters in the data, in the kind of more extensive data set, says about 3.5 billion people who are potentially interested in Facebook. The fraction of people who adopt Facebook after a contact is in the order of 0.2% or 0.3%. This is assuming there are, I think, 100 interactions per year. with somebody else. So a typical person would convince 2.6 of their friends, 0.26 of their friends per year to adopt Facebook through word of mouth. So less than a person per year, which is a reasonable range. And then the advertising effectiveness is about 1%. That is, each year about 1% of population adopts Facebook through, or 1% of potential adopters adopts Facebook through other channels. So those become, give you a decent fit with the data. Now, we have kind of rushed through the steps of system dynamics process, from defining a problem to building a qualitative set of dynamic hypotheses to building a quantitative model, to fitting that quantitative model to data and comparing that with the data. And what we can see in this case is actually our theory probably is capturing some reasonable mechanisms that can replicate some of the empirical patterns. Now, of course, in this case, the empirical patterns we are fitting, the data is only for the number of users of Facebook. This is not a very reliable quantitative test of the model, because you're only fitting one dimension, one aspect of a model. For a more serious validation of the model, you need to capture multiple dimensions of the data. If you had data, for example, on people's perception of how attractive Facebook is, if you had data on kind of the number of potential users of Facebook, if you have data on advertising cost that Facebook puts into kind of promoting the platform and so on, then you could have done a more rigorous test of these hypotheses and some other hypotheses as well. For now, we are not able to do that in this short time we have. Moreover, you should be always mindful that hypotheses, the best we can do is to reject them. So the fact that the model fits the data reasonably well, at least this data, only tells us that we can't reject the hypothesis that word of mouth and advertising are decent explanatory mechanisms for the pathway that Facebook has taken over time. You need more data to see what other mechanisms, or maybe more viable explanatory mechanisms here. And we really haven't done much modeling beyond these two loops. So you could incorporate other mechanisms in your model. You can try to match multiple empirical time series rather than just matching the adopters. And then you can, once you have done a little bit more of that, you can start to use this model as a more generic model that explains beyond just the Facebook's case and may apply to a series of cases and a series of empirical regularities that Facebook's growth is only an example of. In this case, you may, for example, apply this emerging theory to the category of social media or social networks. And here is a graph you can see for a few of the big players of social media over time, from the time they started until years later, how much they have grown. You can see that Facebook is kind of the largest in this group, at least. This is kind of a couple of years old data. But TikTok has been the fastest growing among the group. And you can see there is similarity across them. They all go through this kind of a S-shaped reference mode. So that's the commonality across these. But also they have differences, both in the speed by which they grow and the magnitude at which they saturate. And those differences kind of inform important theoretical questions. What drives different rates of growth? What drives different saturation levels or kind of stabilization levels? And in fact, if you have a very good model, it may go beyond the very narrowly defined category you started with, it may actually go beyond that. In this case, you may go into the more general category of diffusion of products and services. And if you look at data and diffusion of products and services, many of those go through the S-shaped mode of behavior. Here are a few of the household goods you might be familiar with, and products from the beginning of 20th century to the beginning of 21st century, their speed of adoption within American households. This allows you to go from what you learn in a single case to building a more generalized model. Of course, models of diffusion of products and services are pretty common. We are not the first one building this model and a little bit of theory behind it, but the process that we have applied can potentially lead to building novel, interesting theory with some generalizability potential. So I hope this gives you a good feel for what system dynamics is about, what kind of the basic building blocks of it are, how you could potentially apply to simple problems. There's a lot more that you need to do before you can actually build serious detailed models. There's a lot of art in it, and kind of how you decide what's the right level of aggregation, what are the feedback loops I want to include first. And there is a lot of kind of established good practice in building models. So it's hard to learn all of that in a session, but you hopefully have now a feel for whether this is an area you get excited about and you want to try your hand in building these types of models. More generally, I see system dynamics to be especially useful in the theory building space, at least, for building these, what you can call meso-level organization theory. That is, it kind of opens what is happening inside the organization, takes the details of the task environment very seriously, and tries to capture operational features that inform behaviors of managers and other actors inside organizational settings, and then captures the feedbacks between those kind of structural features of the organization and human features of the organization. By doing so, it can become a little bit more grounded in the empirical cases. It can get close enough to empirical data that you can actually start estimating these system dynamics models, which starts to bridge the kind of more larger scale empirical work to more theoretical modeling work. This is, I think, one of the more exciting spaces that we have a lot to do and learn and more and build more, both tool-wise and in terms of insights. So I hope you're also finding this interesting and potentially work on some of these ideas. Now, having said that, you should also be mindful of limitations and costs of engaging in modeling. Building these kind of detailed models that kind of are informed by field work and qualitative data is expensive, is more expensive than a kind of a mechanism-driven theoretical modeling piece where you just kind of concoct the core ideas in your head, but you don't necessarily need as much empirical data, even qualitative data, to inform what you want to capture. In my experience, the review process for these types of grounded theory combined with modeling is a little bit more noisy, because you get reviewers who are typically expert in one or the other, the qualitative data collection or modeling, or the content area. Few people have expertise in all of those, which makes the reviewers' feedback usually focus on one set of issues and less sensitive to the complexity of integrating these different methods. But it still works, and there is quite a bit of literature here. Is a very biased sample of kind of both texts for learning system dynamics on the top, and if you want to pick just one, I would say John Sterman's Business Dynamics is the one to go with. and then papers mostly on theory building, but also a few policy papers that use system dynamics, so that you have a feel for kind of how these tools are being used and how folks have been publishing using these methods in the literature you might be familiar with. So I hope these resources are useful, and I hope this session would give you kind of the type of basic familiarity you may be looking for to know whether this is an area you want to invest in more. Thank you.